Hey guys, it's Neversync. I want to talk about the endgame of Diablo 4 and my overall impressions of the game. I've played it a lot over the last week. I've reached level 85 with my rogue, geared here close to perfection, tried out nightmare dungeons up to tier 50, and then dozens of hell tides. I'd like to share my impressions, thoughts, potential improvement suggestions, and problems with this experience. Before I start, I recommend treating this video more like an audio. I don't usually do this type of format, but I do hope you will find my review enjoyable nevertheless. Thank you. In the background, you'll find footage of me playing my rogue in the Hell Tides and the Nightmare Dungeons. Alright, let's start. I'd like to note that I'm not trying to directly compare it with Path of Exile. I think both games are very different. I think it's beneficial for the market and for the players if there's multiple good ARPGs on the market. I think PoE provides a much more in-depth experience, while Diablo tries to be a more casual and a more streamlined experience. They might be competing for the same player's time, but I think chances are players will be playing either both or would only play one of the other one either way. Right, let's start. Now there's a lot of topics to cover, and we'll first talk about the multiplayer impact, itemization, combat, skill trees, Paragon, and challenges. And we'll start with the multiplayer. Diablo 4 is an always online multiplayer game. At least it calls itself that. Essentially, I would not call it multiplayer. From my many hours in Diablo 4, my impressions of multiplayer was that, well, it exists. Sometimes players will join you in the events you're doing. Sometimes you will join other players in the events they are doing. In both cases, you get your loot a little bit faster. I never had the problem of negatively competing with someone for any kind of loot or materials. At the same time, I didn't have any kind of epic raid experiences either. Essentially, since Diablo 4 does not have a trading system either, unless you're actively partying up with someone, Diablo 4 is mostly a single player experience, and the multiplayer is a little bit of a cherry on top or a minor problem depending on your standpoint. Now let me jump into our first big topic, and that is the combat. Now the combat in Diablo 4 is a bit of a mixed bag, and it also is super build dependent. I would call the combat fun, fluid, and fast overall, but this highly depends on the build you're playing. In the endgame, things become quite messy. Let's say in a dungeon tier 40, you might be fighting 5-6 elites at the same time. This is not uncommon. Each of them has special abilities. Their abilities are often AoE abilities, and often you will not be really having full clarity on what's going on. Sometimes important ground AoEs like freezes or on-death explosions might not be visible depending on your build. I've seen it overlap negatively with some skills I've been using. And it really depends on the build you're playing. Now I've been playing a lot of different rogue builds, and on my melee rogue, while the melee rogue was arguably stronger, at least a little bit, it was also much less fun to play. Essentially, in the endgame, you would jump into a bunch of monsters, death trap them all together, basically pull them all together, spam your cooldowns, and hold right click and essentially sometimes potion up. There's not much more to it. It wasn't really fun, and while it looked visually pleasing at the start, it got boring quite fast. At the same time, playing a ranged rogue, now that was a completely different experience. I had to use my cooldowns in a clever way. I had to position myself much better and use positioning in a much more efficient and satisfying way, using penetrating shots to pull together with combination with death trap a ton of enemies at the same time, do huge damage numbers, use my humans, use cooldowns. It was a much better experience. And I've heard similar things from other players. Essentially, I think certain builds are much more fun and much more clean to play than others. I don't want to call it a melee problem at this point because I haven't tried the other melee classes, but it might just be one. The combat itself can be quite fast-paced or quite slow-paced depending on the content you're doing as well. Once a character is properly geared up in areas like Hell Tides, you'll probably be breezing through the combats. Jumping from one pack to another, exploding them with a lot of abilities, jumping back on your mount, jumping from event to event, and it'll be fast and can be quite fun might also be a little bit too fun for you, or sorry, not too fast for you, depending on your standpoint. At the same time, nightmare dungeons, and I'll talk about both in detail soon, those can be quite slow and procedural, with even the trash mobs sometimes posing quite a bit of a challenge. This is also a bit of my complaint here. A lot of power of the mobs comes from their actual base type. So an elite mob, let's say an elite, I don't know, bear or zombie, is actually fairly harmless compared to something like an elite or even a regular wasp from my experience. Because some monsters have such aggressive attacks, and some of them also tend to use some quite defensive and dangerous movements. So I found, ironically, one of the most dangerous mobs I found were quill rats. Now, if you ever played the Diablo game, quill rats are not really looking too threatening. It's one of the first enemies you encounter in Diablo 2, and they're essentially porcupines, like small porcupines that shoot single quills at you. But these things are deadly in Diablo 4, much more deadly than some huge knight in armor or some skeleton. And some ghosts and some wasps and some other enemies or some of these demon snakes, they're much more dangerous because of their special abilities compared to a lot of other enemies. And this also has impact on the endgame, as you're playing different dungeons and these have very different enemies. So this is a bit of a balancing problem there. Overall, I think the combat in Diablo 4 is quite good. You won't be encountering too many issues with it. It's fun, it's quite dynamic. Things like shrines and different elites spice up the game quite a bit. The bosses are nothing special, but they do have an array of different attacks to dodge, and I think overall you'll be having quite a bit of fun with the combat. Next up, let us discuss the skill tree and the Paragon board. These are two systems that you get access to by simply leveling up that will provide you power and build customization. Now the skill trees overall are okay. They allow for a series of different builds. I think they might need a bit more choices there, because for instance with the rogue, basically you have 5 main skills, and sure you have some additional skills like traps and imbuements, and these definitely add a lot of spice to the game, and are often some of the coolest things you have on a class. However, overall, basically every rogue will be using one of these 5 core attacks, which is Flurry, Twisting Blades, and 3 different arrow attacks, one of them being Penetrating Shot, which I enjoyed the most. And that's pretty much it. So the build diversity per class, while there's a ton of sub-builds per class out there, is sometimes a little bit low. Now, don't let this discourage you. I don't mean to tell you that there's only like 5 builds or 5 rogues out there. There's a ton of different builds to play out there, but what I mean by that is essentially the 5 skills you unlock at pretty much level 3 or 4, you'll be still using one of those 5 skills in the very end game. And this is mostly true for pretty much all other classes. Some of them have a few later skills to unlock, like the sorceress. But overall, you might see it a little bit as a disadvantage if you like something, let's say in Diablo 2 or in Path of Exile, where as you keep leveling up, you unlock skills that are just much more powerful and much stronger or even much better. Now, in Diablo 4, it works a little bit different. Instead of unlocking more core skills, you usually unlock more cooldowns, more conditional skills, more mobility, more defensive skills. You unlock ultimates, a lot of passives, and you get to combine those. And quite frankly, I think their system works. Sometimes I feel like there might need to be a bit more options out there, but overall I think it's quite a fun and dynamic system. You can respec anytime there's some marginal small cost attached to that in terms of gold, but you can still pretty much respec all the time, play around with things, play around with different skills and support abilities. And I quite enjoyed this. So while there are some limitations to it, I think overall the skill trees are fine, at least for the current state. One problem I have with the system is that you only can pick 6 skills. This has an upside. The player has to balance the really important and vital cooldowns and abilities, but it also has a downside that in the end you will usually, especially towards high tier nightmare dungeons, you'll be optimizing towards just having efficient utility abilities, and having to sacrifice a lot of quality of life, which means you often have to pick between things that provide you with mobility and movement speed or general quality of life, or having more defenses and crowd control. I don't think things like movement speed and mobility and quality of life should be gated behind such features, but I don't know. Tell me what you think about that in the comments. A very curious and cool decision by Diablo 4 is to give you skill points until you reach level 50, which is pretty much by the end of the campaign. Afterwards, you'll be only receiving Paragon points instead of the skill points. Paragon points are a huge source of power in the endgame. I have mixed feeling about those, but overall I'm actually quite impressed by them. Overall, you'll be receiving over 200 points and you can use them to travel through different boards, unlocking different glyph sockets, socketing special glyphs in there that you can somewhat compare to Diablo 3 gems, the legendary ones. You can also unlock special abilities on the Paragon board. Overall, the Paragon board serves as a late game damage multiplier. Pretty much most Paragon boards will provide you with some sort of a strong legendary passive that will usually equate to 15 to 20% overall more damage multiplier. The glyphs themselves will also be very valuable. So for every about 50 points, you'll be receiving a 30, 40, 50% multiplicative damage boost. In the end, the Paragon board, however, has a ton of false complexity. While you receive over 200 points and are able to socket in a ton of glyphs with special requirements and bonus effects and receive legendary passives, in the end, the way it works, you'll be receiving pretty much 4 to 5 legendary passives, 4 to 5 glyphs, and a bunch of small passive points, and then there's a bunch of non-interesting micro-optimization choices. Things like, okay, do I pass to the top direction or to the bottom direction? Which direction is shorter? And these are basically optimization problems. So in theory, this whole thing could be dumbed down to pretty much 5 glyphs and 5 special passives that you would unlock pretty much every 5 levels after level 50. However, it should be noted there's a little bit more to that. There are some choices like which Paragon board do you insert first that actually has some impact on the cost of the additional optional requirements. There are some choices like the rotation of the Paragon boards, which might you allow to optimize beelining towards one node or another fast glyph. Overall, I think it's a decent system. I think I would like to see a little bit more to do there. And I do like the fact that you unlock 4 points per level so that the endgame progression feels a little bit fluid. Since in the endgame, leveling up takes quite a bit of time, the fact that you get an additional points 4 times per level and not just 4 points every level is actually a nice, it's actually a nice approach and I do like it. Right, now let's talk about the big thing, items and itemization. I've been very worried about the itemization in Diablo 4 and I'm pleasantly surprised that most, not all, but most of my worries actually did not happen. The endgame itemization is okay. It's not great, but it's quite solid at the same time. There are different stats to look out for. It's more than just, hey, I just want as much DPS and as much armor on my weapon and armors. Like more or less like it was in Diablo 3, and only then you would care about things like dexterity, crit damage, crit chance, and so forth. Different slots come with different interesting stats. You do have things like cooldown recovery, energy generation, reduced costs. You do have things like resistances, which do work a little bit weird. There's a lot of damage reduction stats, and you can focus on damage reduction from close enemies, ranged enemies, there's like distant enemies. There's a lot of different interesting choices you can make. And on top of that comes the aspect system. Now, I'm not sure how I feel about the aspect system. The aspect system is fairly cool because it allows you to add additional functionalities to different abilities or unlock additional passives like recovering energy when you hit enemies with basic attacks, or to deal more damage if you stand still, Or, for instance, one of my favorite passives, when you enter stealth with Rogue, you can place multiple poison traps at the same time, and when stealth ends, all of those explode at the same time. So this is a really, really cool playstyle, which actually enables practical stealth. Those in theory sound really cool. However, I do think there's a bit of a problem there as well. Because aspects pretty much replace the legendary items in Diablo, legendary items don't quite exist like that. Yes, there's a higher tier called unique items, but unique items are pretty much the same items with the only difference that their normal stats are pretty much predefined and you can't change or extract their special feature. And this results in a bit of an issue that once you have most of your aspects set up, all you're looking out for are slightly better stats. Like you would only be looking for, well, can I get like 2% more damage reduction on my legs? Or can I get a pair of gloves with +3 to my skills instead of +2? And there's very few chase uniques or chase items out there. And once your aspects are pretty much set up, all you're looking for are slight stat improvements. Now, I think this could be solved in multiple ways. The most foremost way is I think Diablo just needs a ton more uniques. Right now, I think there's like 8 uniques per class, and I think 8 uniques that drop in general. And this is just a very, very low amount. On top of that, I would like to see more itemization, customization options. For instance, the socket system right now is incredibly boring. It's probably the most boring socket system I've seen. You essentially have a bunch of gems and they clutter up your inventory, they don't even stack correctly, and they have a few mediocre interesting effects like +3% life in body armor, and you can add the sockets at any time at a jeweler, so that basically just adds a little bit of homework what you need to do when you switch equipment. It's not even any kind of gating, or it's not a benefit that you evaluate if it is interesting. There's just nothing good to say about the socket system. It's just boring. However, while I do have my complaints about the system, overall my complaints are mostly that, hey, we need more content. Not that the system is fundamentally flawed. I think the socket system needs to be expanded. I think that it needs to be more uniques. Maybe uniques or special items could drop with like double aspects or some additional affix, something like that. I don't actually miss the Diablo 3 system of ancestral items, but in the very end game, I would like to see more insensitive to farm higher tier dungeons, which currently don't provide anything interesting or special overall. Speaking of nightmare dungeons, let's talk about the endgame systems. So in the endgame of Diablo 4, you have basically 3 groups of things to do. You have the map rift-like system called the Nightmare Dungeons. You have the open world systems that are Hell Tides, open world quests, Legion bosses, world bosses, and Tree of Whisper quests. And then you have the boilerplate things to do. Town time, inventory management transitions, and renown farming. I'm going to cover all of these, and we're going to start with the Nightmare Dungeons. Oh, and before I jump into Nightmare Dungeons, I should quickly talk about the world tiers. Diablo has 4 world tiers. You start with world tier 1 or 2, which is basically normal mode and slightly harder mode. And afterwards, at level 50, after doing a small dungeon, you will unlock world tier 3, which will unlock a ton of different endgame activities, like Hell Tides and Nightmare Dungeons. It's not a ton, it's actually mostly just those 2, but those are quite impactful. Afterwards, after reaching level 70-ish, or you can also do it earlier, I did this level 60, you can unlock tier 4. The difference between tier 1 and 2, tier 3 and tier 4, is that on tier 3 you can find sacred gear, and on tier 4 you find ancestral gear. Those are generally speaking just beefed up versions of your gear, which make your previous gear a little bit obsolete. This is both at the same time exciting, but also a little bit annoying because you basically have to replace all of your previous gear and it's pretty much worthless, but it does provide the power boost you need to adjust to the new world tier. With that said, let's talk about Nightmare Dungeons. Before you get into Nightmare Dungeons and already doing the story, you'll be doing a lot of normal dungeons. In these dungeons, you usually have some event to do, like kill all monsters and afterwards collect 2 bloodstones and then kill a boss. Nightmare Dungeons are pretty much the same thing, with the difference that there's a few affixes on top of that. Things like you can do a little bit more lightning damage, but then there's some stone chasing you and to do lightning poses and you have to dodge those. And on top of that, monsters have something like lifesteal and they resist bleed damage. These affixes are random, sometimes they're a little bit more impactful, sometimes they're less impactful. As with systems like maps and PoE, you want to run the ones that are positive for you and don't damage or don't mess with your build. Nightmare Dungeons also come in tiers from tier 1 to tier 100 and they get harder quite quick. One big problem with the system is that there's no real reason to run high tier Nightmare Dungeons. You'll be getting more XP and more gold there, and items will drop with slightly more DPS and slightly more armor there, but that's basically it. There are no special uniques or special events or something like that happening in high tier dungeons. And I think this is a bit of a problem, because once you're basically steadily farming your dungeons and most of your gear is ancestral level, and after you've done Helltides for a while, there's just not much to do out there in the game right now, I think. That being said, it takes a while to get there, so you will probably need around a week of active no-lifing to get to this point, and I think the problem will be once again solved quite well by adding more items, potentially more endgame bosses or some additional endgame activities. Once again, this is a point where Diablo is lacking content, but the actual system is okay. But let's talk about the Nightmare Dungeons themselves a bit more. I do have some problems with them. Some Nightmare Dungeons are significantly faster or better than others. Some objectives are very boring. I absolutely hate the objective to kill all monsters. Sometimes the dungeons are generated in a way that you have to backtrack and backtrack quite a bit. If you die, sometimes the respawn point in the dungeon could be God knows where. Sometimes it can even be ahead of the spot where you died. This is also weird. It could also bug out your dungeon. But this happened to me, I think, like once or twice, semi-twice. Once I respawned past the barrier but could proceed, and once it just completely destroyed my dungeon. Overall, however, I think the Nightmare Dungeon experience is quite decent. There are some things to improve, but it's fun. The density is usually quite good. There's enough diversity of events and dangers and monsters and affixes and shrines to keep you grinding the dungeons away. And trying out higher dungeons is a fun challenge. Now let's talk about their Helltides. Helltides happen every 2 hours for a duration of 1 hour, and during that time an area on the map will be overrun by demons. The atmosphere will be red, there will be meteors falling down from the sky, special events will occur, and the whole area will have a lot more monster density. Essentially, Helltides are just a juiced up area, but there are 2 things that make Helltides actually quite fun. First of all, in the whole area, everything will drop these special blood shard things. And when you collect those blood shards, you can use them to open chests. Now importantly, those blood shards, they don't stay on your account. Once the Helltide ends, you lose those blood shards. Also, if you die, you lose a part of these blood shards. These blood shards can be used to open special chests, and these drop quite a bit of loot. Also importantly, there are these special mystery blood shard chests that you can open with 175 shards, which is a little bit, not too much, but it takes a bit of farming. And these drop a lot of valuable materials, and on top of that, always like 2 to 5 unique legendaries, so they're quite good. Now, what makes Hell Shards really good and what really works, and I think this is actually a very clever idea by Diablo 4, is that Helltides make you feel clever. Essentially, they give the player the full player agency. You can fight whatever, but you're encouraged to seek places where you can do an event at the same time. Maybe also at the same time you do a Tree of Whispers event, and you do some Helltides fights at the same time. So essentially, you'll be taking those usual world events that you've seen a lot, and turning them into something juicy and fun because of all of the density and health shards you'll be receiving. And I think this is quite a clever approach, because the first time I played the Diablo beta, I was afraid that these events will surely get boring in the endgame. I've done them like 3 times during the beta. I was like, oof, not another jar of souls. I know exactly how this goes. Kill like 100 mobs, collect 30 souls, and you're done. But if combined with like multiple potential objectives that you do at the same time, more density and more bosses, this actually is fun. And despite the events being very repetitive, I always was enjoying doing the Helltides event over and over. Now, there's a bit of an issue that Helltides occur every second hour, so there's a bit of this fear of missing out thing going on, which is also a bit present in the shop. I'm not sure how I feel about it. I actually like the every second hour thing, because it kind of, while Helltides are very good, it kind of makes you alternate between different content and gives Nightmare Dungeons a bit more focus. And I don't hate it, but I can see it being changed. I wouldn't hate it being changed either. I would be very interesting how you guys are feeling about this specific feature. On top of Helltides, there's also some other events, but pretty much all the other endgame open world events are pretty uninteresting. The world bosses are fun to do for the first or second time, but they are pretty trivial, and even after the buffs, they take like 2 to 3 minutes. They're not challenging. They provide a bit of a loot pinata, and they have quite a bit of cooldown on their loot, so you can do them like every 3 days to receive the bonus loot reward. There's the Whisper quest, which essentially just puts a marker on a bunch of dungeons and bunch of events and areas on the map where you get some bonus points, and if you collect 10 of them, you'll receive some extra rewards. Then there's the usual world events, and there's the Legion events, which are pretty much a tanking spank, longer fight. It's not challenging, you just kill some mobs together with some other players for like 5 minutes, and afterwards you get a few boxes. And what makes these events really work is if they're combined with the Helltides. Otherwise, they are essentially not too interesting. But with Helltides, they are. Now, an issue I see is that Helltides, even on difficulty 4, will become quite easy after a bit of farming. For my rogue now at level 85, I can one-shot bosses, I can one-shot pretty much whole packs at this point with Shadow Imbuement, Poison Imbuement, destroys any elite with a single arrow. So I wish there would be more difficulty and more incentive to actually do higher tier content, as discussed with Nightmare Dungeons already, to actually have more challenge while farming. Helltides get the reward part right, but the challenge part in Helltides is not quite as good, I think. And that brings us to the third part of the endgame activities, the boilerplate events. And those are not real events, but this is the time you'll spend transitioning from map to map, the time you spend in the town, and renown quests. Renown quests are basically all kinds of world activities that could be exploration, doing normal dungeons, doing side quests, seeking Altars of Lilith, that will award you with renown. And renown is pretty much a reputation system for a single area, and once you do enough of that, you'll get some skill points, potion upgrades, and Paragon points. I really dislike the renown system. Now, it is shared for the whole account, so after you do it once, it applies to a second character, but it involves basically searching for these Lilith altars that are hidden all around the world, and there's over 100 of them. They provide you with some, not significant, but if you get all of the 100 altars, it is a significant power boost. They're important to do if you want to get the renown system done, and the renown system itself basically awards you with skill points, potions, maximum potion slots, and maximum Paragon points general. So it is important to get those things done, and to get the whole renown system done, you actually need to spend significant time just going through the world, doing these side quests, searching for the altars, and this wasn't really too fun during the first playthrough, and doing this every season is, yeah, it's going to be terrible, I think. I think this needs to change. On top of that, if you dislike the PoE campaign, releveling your characters, I personally do, you will hate this part. Doing this even once a league sounds really, really boring to me, and I do hope they change the system. A big part of my complaints about Diablo also comes to the time you spend during the town in Diablo. I don't feel like the NPCs are well placed. In every single town, they are spaced out artificially to increase the time you spend in towns. You need to ride around through the town quite a bit. You have quite long ways from one NPC to another one. This could take like 5 to 10 to 20 seconds depending on where you're going. You are doing this multiple times during every play session, especially while leveling or improving gear. You will have to first upgrade the gear, then try, go add a gem socket, try, add an imbuement, then try, go to your stash, maybe you turn in some orbos, then try, sell something. It's just not fun. Now, these are sometimes fast, and maybe you get lucky and you can just vendor everything, but this is definitely not good. This is made worse by the fact that the gem or the whole inventory system is just really bad. Really bad. Not by any kind of modern standards. There's no prepper search in the stash tab. The gems don't go in their own inventory part, so they clutter up your inventory, and I've complained about the gems and the soccer system in general already, but I think this is... I don't know who designed this. I don't know why it was designed like this. It feels completely out of place. And then the whole inventory management itself just doesn't feel very pleasant. I think all of that could be vastly improved, and I think just in general centralizing NPCs, putting the gems in their own tab, I think this would be a big improvement to the enjoyment of the game. I don't really like it when games try to extend the experience by making you do boring tasks. Now, speaking of boring tasks, transitions. Another feature is when you start a new nightmare dungeon, you don't just spawn there. You need to go to the nearest waypoint and ride there. Now, this isn't too terrible. Most of the time, this ride time is 1 to 2 minutes, and it is somewhat fun, but it's once again something that I would be perfectly okay with skipping and not doing. I think this is another simple avenue that the game could become better, but then again, this is a way smaller problem for me than the problem with the town and NPC spacing. Now, I've touched on the screen clarity part before, but damage numbers and vulnerability messages, and I know that other classes have other messages, are really annoying during fighting and during gameplay. I think this is another avenue where Diablo needs to be improved a lot. This is by no means a critical issue, but this is annoying. I would like to know my biggest crits, and at the same time I would like to not see every single dot, and ideally I would like to disable the vulnerability message unless it maybe happens on a big boss or something like that. Maybe it could be filtered by enemy type, but shooting one arrow and then basically turning a whole area into just numbers, I don't think that's a good thing. Now, let me quickly touch on the campaign without spoiling anything. I think overall the story was quite good, especially by Diablo standards. The characters were likable. It took a bit of time to take off, like I felt the first 3 acts were quite boring, but afterwards it really took up and really picked up pace. It really became quite good, especially the final acts were really well done. Now, there were some characters missing that I would have really expected. On top of that, I felt that some characters shouldn't have survived and other characters should have died, and at some spots I felt like my deeds or achievements were a bit unclear, and some antagonist motivations were a bit... well, I couldn't understand what they were after in the end, to be honest. But if you ignore these points, and I know it sounds like a lot, the story is actually very enjoyable. I do recommend watching the cutscenes. I do recommend watching the animated cutscenes as well, and listening to the characters, the main characters. These are all quite good. Do skip every side quest. Some of them are decent, but overall they're very repetitive and very boring, but the main story is quite good. A potential complaint I have is the mount though. You only receive the mount pretty much in the end of the campaign. This just feels weird because at this point you're basically this legendary hero who has saved the world from several big evils, and you still don't get a freaking horse while everyone else has one. But you do get one at the end of the campaign, and it's quite good. It is sometimes a little bit buggy and slows down for reasons somewhat unknown to me. And during area transitions, I think there are some server issues sometimes, which makes it glitch out a tiny bit. But these things are kind of very minor. Overall, the horse is quite good and a big improvement to your endgame ability. Now, let's quickly touch up on the graphics, controls, inputs, and sound. Overall, all of these points are pretty excellent. Diablo looks good, if you ignore the screen clutter at times. Diablo sounds good. The controls are smooth. I do recommend changing the binding so that you have an always war key and you don't just auto attack with your left button. But overall, I think Diablo is a very well crafted game from the technical perspective. I also experienced very little problems with the multiplayer aspect. I think, especially considering the launch of Diablo 3 and Overwatch 2 and other things Blizzard has done, overall the launch was very smooth, and I was very worried the multiplayer part would be destroying the game, but with the exception of one evening where there was a 1 hour outage, everything else was really smooth and near perfect. So technically, Diablo 4 is a very good looking game, a very good sounding game. I should be honest here and say that when I've been playing the Path of Exile 2 alpha 4 years ago, and my memories of it are a little bit hazy at this point, but I felt like the game was even at that point absolutely competitive with Diablo 4. So this shouldn't be something completely exceptional. But something I would like to add here is that Diablo 4 also has amazing armor sets. I've been worried that the in-game shop would be basically mandatory because the characters look like trash, and they don't. I absolutely love the armor sets. I've seen those on the other classes and they look great. I absolutely love the rogue sets. I love to tinker around with the armor and with the colors. It looks just great, like no complaints there. There is an in-game shop there. It's a bit weird that it is there and the prices are quite steep, but if you won't ever touch it, it's perfectly fine. I think the the monetization, especially considering what they've done with Diablo Immortal, is very much okay. Now, I would have preferred they wouldn't do like Battle Pass stuff, but I do realize that nowadays engineers need payment, and especially if you want the game with like a live service model that comes with seasons, you do need to monetize it somehow. It is sadly the case that servers and people don't pay themselves. So let's sum up the experience. Let's give it a numeric rating. Let me tell you my recommendation. Is Diablo a good game? Yes. Is it an amazing and great game? Not yet. It has the opportunity to become that in the future. Most of its problems are fixable. Most of its problems are not systematic, but just content-wise. It needs more uniques. It needs more endgame sensitives to do high-tier dungeons. It might need some additional skills. The socket system needs some improvements, and it could use the one or other quality of life fix. But overall, it's already really good now, and I would rate it somewhere between 6 to 7 out of 10. I've spent the last week pretty much playing it non-stop, so I think 7 out of 10 is quite fair. I don't think in the current form it is something that will in any case or form be comparable to Path of Exile for me. I think it lacks the complexity for that. I don't think, but it highly depends on what Blizzard will do with the seasons. And this is a big question. So right now it's a bit of a Schrodinger's box game thing. We don't really know how it will turn out until the seasons will release, and we'll see like 2 or 3 seasons. If it will go down the power creep way like Diablo 3 went, I don't think I'll be playing Diablo 4 a lot in the future. However, if it will have well-crafted seasons, well thought out content, more and interesting uniques, if it will work on its weaknesses and introduce new systems and events, I think Diablo has the potential to become a great ARPG, especially compared to Diablo 3, which was quite a lackluster at release and alrightish, but nothing exceptional after Reaper of Souls, in my opinion. Now, let's do a quick comparison to Path of Exile. I don't think we should be comparing them because they're very different games. But for the sake of argument, let's give it a try nevertheless. PoE is a very different game. It has active trading, it has much more complexity, it has much more complex itemization, it has a lot more choices in terms of build creation and a lot more flexibility. Diablo right now excels with much better graphics, a little bit but not significantly more screen clarity. Diablo has more crisp combat, great animations, great sound design. If you're valuing open world, you'll definitely like Diablo more. But something that I feel like PoE has done really well and Diablo is really failing at is the map generation. I think in PoE is absolutely excelling at the ability of generating good layouts and filling these layouts with well-placed combat. This is something you can definitely see Diablo struggle with all of the backtracking and nightmare dungeon design. Still, I think both games can absolutely coexist. Both games are in a good spot, and I'm excited to see how these games will inspire and influence each other in the future. Oof, now I've been ranting for almost 40 minutes, and I do hope you enjoyed my overview about Diablo 4 in its current state. Now please keep in mind that I'm pretty sure all of these things are about to change. I think if you're a Diablo fan, or if you've played PoE for quite a while and want a more streamlined experience, you should definitely check it out. But at the same time, I think if you wait for a season or two, if you're uncertain, well, just do that. I think the game will become better, and I do hope it will have a successful future. With that said, I'm super excited for the PoE 2 announcement, for the teaser released a few days ago. The game looks absolutely gorgeous, and I'll be definitely not abandoning PoE. I think Path of Exile will still remain my main ARPG, but I do think I'll be checking out the Diablo seasons as well. Now, I would like to ask you to tell me what you think about this format. Usually I do these types of reviews on Twitter, but I think writing 120 messages is probably not an optimal format. I would appreciate a little feedback from you. Thanks for listening. It's been fun talking about it. I hope you're enjoying the game and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.